Hey everyone, welcome back to another powerful episode of Healthy Mind, Healthy Life, the podcast where real conversations meet the transformation. Yes. And dear listeners, today we are diving into a story that is, I would say, deeply personal and profoundly universal. Fortunate Sons. Yes. Yeah. So this powerful new PBS documentary brings together the graduating class of 1974 from the Harvard School for Boys in Los Angeles, a group of men who, after 5 decades, reflect on their friendships, struggles, masculinity, mental health, and the changing tides of society. Yeah. So, what started as the online calls during the pandemic became something much bigger, like a rare window into vulnerability, humor, and healing. So the film is directed by Emmy and Peabody Award winning filmmaker Peter Jones and produced by visionary creative leader John Bird Knowles and Taylor Racine Harrell. So the film is we'll definitely discuss about in details in the discussion today, dear listeners. Who has shaped the culture through entertainment, activism, and the storytelling, I would say. So together, they have created like not just a film. I would say it's a movement, like one that invites us to rethink like what it means to be men, friends, and human beings. Yes, human beings in today's world. So, dear listeners, before we delve deep into the discussion, I'll quickly love to introduce with our lovely guest today. So, starting with Peter Jones. So, Peter is a no stranger to telling the unforgettable stories, a two-time Emmy winner, Peabody Award recipient, and the creator of landmark films like Johnny Carson, King of Late Night, and Inventing LA. So, Peter has built a career capturing the essence of culture, icons, and the history. So, now with Fortunate Sons, he turns the lens inward to his own classmates, like unearthing a deeply human portrait of friendship, resilience, and masculinity over 50 years. So, welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you. That was the best introduction and setup I've ever had.
Thank you, Peter. It means a lot. And
We can leave now.
exactly. I mean, it's huge, right? Definitely. The listeners, on the other hand, we have John. So John has spent his career blending storytelling with the social impact, like from producing the cult classics like the Basketball Diaries and Swing Kids to pioneering the digital film production and championing activism through the art. And John has always pushed boundaries. Yes. So with Fortunate Sons, he helps spark a much needed national conversation on the connection, mental health, and shifting definitions of manhood. So, welcome to the show. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you for having us.
Amazing. And dear listeners, on the other hand, we have Taylor Vasine Harrell. So she is a producer and activist with a gift for bringing the hidden cultural histories to life. So since 2018, she's worked alongside with Peter on the projects like Blue Sky, Metropolis, and All Man, the international male story, which premiered at Tribeca. So her personal work centers on social justice, civil rights, and her short film, Faith Alone, screening at festivals nationwide and on KCET's Fine Cut. So for Fortunate Sons, she served as a producer and lead the archivist, weaving in rich cultural context from the 1970s era that she loves to bring authenticity and depth to the story. So, welcome to the show, Taylor.
Thank you so much. That's all very true. Thank you.
Yes, it is.
Exactly. So, welcome to the show, and it's really an honor to have all of you here. And Fortunate Sons. So, to start with, I'll definitely love to start with Peter. I mean, so you have told that the stories of legends like Judy Garland, Betty Davis, and Johnny Carson. So, what made you decide to turn the camera towards your own classmates? I mean, and obviously yourselves for the Fortunate Sons.
I owe my presence to my classmates, in particular, John, because when I first attended these Zoom calls where our classmates were meeting during COVID quarantine, they started meeting and someone thought, well, this would be an interesting thing to perhaps chronicle leading up to our 50th reunion, which was happening 4 years into the future in 2024. And they asked me, and my first reaction was, who would give a shit about a bunch of privileged white men? Is there a more hated demographic in the world today? And that was my own terrible judgment because 2 years later, I apologized to all the guys because in 2 years, I interviewed 30 men who opened their hearts and minds. And it turned out to be the most rewarding personal experience of my career because I went in with some assumptions about who these men were going to be. And I brought my own biases. And this is a film about shedding our biases and listening to what and who we really are. So I am grateful to John for bringing me in and also for staying with the project, for helping raise all the money for the project because it's supported by classmates and people he knows, and it would not have happened without his everyday involvement.
Amazing. So quick thing, like I mean, did it feel like a riskier, like more vulnerable, um, to tell a story like uh, which is close to home compared to your past projects?
You know, it really is it's the same process for me, whether it's like a famous iconic person like Judy Garland, or you mentioned Johnny Carson, because I approach every story as a character study where I'm trying to dig in and offer some insights that I have observed in the interviews I do with people about a particular subject. In this case, it was each of us, we were digging deep, but I did the same kind of approach where I'm asking certain questions to help reveal the character. And in this case, it was the character of the person I was actually interviewing and also my own. But it was the same kind of process of looking for certain character traits that then allow me to find a story, pulling those character traits together.
And Peter sort of shortcuts himself a little bit in terms of giving me credit here the way he did, but this would not have been anything without, well, him in general and Taylor, but particularly his amazing interviewing skills. And that's a generic statement. And what it comes down to is being genuinely curious and genuinely respectful of the people you're talking to and being a human being with everybody in a very deep, meaningful way. And for this film and what it's about, it's sort of like elemental central piece of the film as a result.
Amazing. Wow. So John, to you, I'll come to you. I mean, thanks to mention that. I mean, it's just really great. So, like, as a producer, like with such a diverse background, like I was mentioning before, like from activism. So, from activism to the Hollywood, what about the story that convinced you to? I mean, it needed to be told, like, and now told now. I mean, if you can share.
Well, the first thing that caught me was quite simply that it was opportunistic. I mean, it's hard to get two men to talk about honestly, to talk about life. And when you're confronted with 30 or 40 of them talking about life in personal, intimate terms with vulnerability, it's sort of like a gift that you can't turn down. And when it was clear that that's what was happening in front of us, that was really what kicked it off, because there's a very few examples in cinema of that kind of storytelling. And I felt like we just had to figure out how to make that happen and take advantage of it. And the guys in our class it's all them. I mean, we're a conduit here. We're a carrier, and hopefully we do well by them. But this was their bravery and their courage and their willingness to trust each other and their desire to step up and have these conversations in the first place, which obviously is a part of COVID and many other things, but it was them that made this really possible and what it is. And we just happened to be there at the right moment.
Exactly. Right moment, yes. So from the right moment, like, was there a moment during those reunion calls when you thought, I mean, this isn't just a conversation, it's a film, I think.
Peter will have an interesting take on that. I felt it wasn't from the calls. It was once we had decided that we should wrap our heads around this, because documentaries are a fascinating form. You don't usually know what they're going to become until you finish them. They don't set out the way a narrative film starts out, with a script and a point of view and a purpose for the most part. And so we engaged with ourselves and with a couple of classmates to wrap our heads around it, who are all, producers on the film in one way or another. And in that conversation, I think started the idea that we were this pivotal generation. We were this pivotal moment that actually made it a more interesting story than just male vulnerability. But the fact that it talked about sort of a generation that came of age in 1968 as 12-year-old boys, in an all-male military religious school, that with Martin Luther King having been killed and Robert Kennedy having been killed, and these sort of iconic figures of liberal hope and progressive hope. And then Woodstock the next year, literally the next year, changing American culture for decades. I mean, kicking off this sort of seismic changes in culture that just kept rolling and rolling and rolling. And once we saw that, I think that's what made me feel it was really a film. From there, it was just how do we find it? How do we bring it out of the marble? And that's what Peter and Taylor did so exquisitely.
And I'd like to add that I've always talked about this film as increments of time. We were all born in 1956. We started going to Harvard School in 1968, which was this tumultuous year in history. And then we were at that school for 6 years, during which we had the Vietnam War, we had Watergate, and then we graduate and we go out into the world, and we reconvene during 2020 during a worldwide pandemic where we're shut up in our homes, and we come together, and it happens to be our 50th reunion, 4 years from when we had those first Zoom calls. So many things had to line up, and they did perfectly. And then this technology, we're using now, this ability to video conference anywhere in the world with one another. So I could record interviews for the price of nothing, and we couldn't have done that before this technology existed. And then the reunion was last May, so we had enough time to pull it all together so it could be brought to the world and still be something that's quite current. And in fact, the subject of masculinity and men and boys has become even more a hot topic, and it just happens to also line up with the film we made. So it was just the circumstances of these increments of time that just came together. All these dots were connected just almost magically.
Perfectly said. I mean, yeah, definitely. And obviously, I totally agree. I mean, these days, because of the technology, it has actually helped us a lot in, like we are doing right now, right? We are recording. It's really very easy. But yes, earlier it was difficult. It was not there. But yeah, and we are here. So
You've probably also seen, though, that it provides an intimacy that
exactly.
people feel comfortable, right, with you. I'm sure you've seen in your interviews.
Yeah.
And we certainly did, that people are in their living rooms or in their lives and just with you one-on-one on a screen, and you connect at a different level.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. And so you were mentioning about the masculinity, and I totally agree, because mental health and masculinity is something which is right now, not right now. I mean, it's always like masculinity was often portrayed as a kind of toughness, silence, or tough it out. But your classmates share their struggles with the candor. So how did you earn that level of honesty on camera? So if you can share.
That is my responsibility, to earn their trust in a very short period of time. And I'm so aware of that privilege and that responsibility, because you can't shortcut that. It can only happen after some extensive telephone calls and Zoom meetings where they feel comfortable enough to be able to say things they haven't said before and do it like this, what we're doing now. I've always been so respectful of how kind of unusual that situation must be for someone. I mean, I've been doing this for many years, but for someone to open up like that I have to earn their trust. And with my classmates, I had to do it with each classmate. This was not something that I just assumed was a given. So I allowed the time for that opening up to occur. I didn't just expect it. And I never do with interviews.
Lovely. Thanks for sharing this. But as you mentioned about also to make them feel that space. So do you think that men today are more ready, or they're still hesitant to have these conversations?
What
To
is
Peter, yeah, yeah,
your thoughts on it?
yeah,
Taylor got to observe this
Yeah.
generation, so her perspective has been
Yeah.
indispensable.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, Peter did have to foster those connections and sort of bring them back up to today. But I think in some ways it's easier to open up about vulnerable things when there is a
Mm.
shared history. When you've seen somebody at 15 years old, when they're going through their awkward stage, there's almost a level of trust built in when they've seen you in that way already. I think there's more of a culture of men being able to open up and share.
Yeah.
And so it's more socially acceptable, but I don't know if it's individually easier necessarily. I think that it depends very much on the environment of the individual man. I'd like to think that culturally there's more acceptance, and so it would be easier, but I think especially depending on somebody's family and how they were raised and just the messages that they're receiving. In some ways, I think it can still be as difficult as ever. But with more media showing examples of opening up and sharing, hopefully it continues to move the needle towards it being just a
Yeah.
normal and acceptable thing. I think there's a lot of opportunities and encouragement for young girls and women to share their feelings, but not always as much for men, especially young men.
Yeah.
And so I hope that the trend continues and isn't just a trend, but is actually a movement towards something else that is so important to our society. Everybody opening up and being honest about what's going on inside leads to a better world for all people, genuinely.
One of our classmates in the film, Brad Leonard, actually says at one point, I
Okay.
think we're all dying to share the pain and suffering and the learnings that we've had over our lives. And I think that's true, but you still need to be given a situation where you
Yeah.
feel trust and comfort in doing that. And not just in a documentary, I think in lives as well. And I think we've often seen that the more hurt that people have had, the more challenges they've absorbed, the more important it is for them to open up and share, but also the more difficult it is.
Yeah.
Because the armor has been built up and built up and built up. So it's a really interesting conundrum for that. And of course, masculinity, just like everything else, exists on a spectrum. There's no right and wrong. There's just people doing it in different ways, people exploring
Yeah.
it in different ways, right? And different levels of vulnerability and openness.
Lovely. I mean, so John and Taylor, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. So, Taylor, you were also mentioning about the vulnerable storytelling, and so John, you have said that the film isn't just about preaching, but it's inviting. So, from that perspective, to both of you, to John and Taylor, did any particular story from the classmates shift your perspective on masculinity? Anything? I mean,
You have a thought, Peter?
I do. One of my classmates, Christopher Hormel, his father was a playboy and his father was his role model. And Christopher freely acknowledged that he learned that women were there for my pleasure, he says in the film, and that he had to look really deep within himself. And he says in the film, who do I want to be? What kind of a man do I want to be? And he made an active choice. He became a Buddhist and a vegan Buddhist because he came from this meatpacking family and fortune. So it's one of the wonderful ironies of the film that the great grandson of the guy who invented Spam, which fed all the troops during World War II, became a Buddhist and also someone who healed that part of him that exploited women. And he talked about it, and he talked about his father's abuse of his mother, and he talked about his father's abuse of him. And that I'm saying all this because this is someone who started out as the prototypical playboy 60s kind of a kid the world is his oyster. And he learned, well, it's not. And I'm acting like an entitled ass and I want to be a better man. So in that case, watching his rapid development from the way he was in high school to the man he is today, that was a remarkable transformation of his type of masculinity.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree about Christopher. It's an extraordinary story, and he's a wonderful person. I grew up very close with Chris. The interesting thing about this film, of course, for Peter and I, is that not just are we filmmakers in this, but we are members of the class, and Peter and I have known each other since first grade, and Christopher and I have known each other since probably first grade as well. And in those years, I was very much a part of his family and part of exposure to that same father and his lifestyle and spending time at his photographic studio and in his world. And so the influences were very similar on me as well. And I never really thought about it at the time in terms of misogyny or abuse or anything. I just saw it as the different shades within the world that we inhabited. My father wasn't like that, but his was, but it was all within the shades. It was all within the way men and women functioned, the dynamic at that period of time. And so it's fascinating. Also in the film, I think John Saliba was evidence for me of a very fascinating thing of the fact that it's never too late to change. Christopher kind of engaged with this at a kind of prime of his life when he kind of came to grips with all that. John is, within the last 10 years has come to grips with his own issues, in this case with women, and his own lack of fidelity and his feelings about himself and self-worth in that respect and everything, and has engaged with his daughter, who called him out on it, to actually say, I want to address this and change, in his 60s. And that was extraordinary to me, that at the point at which people mostly feel calcified in their lives, that you don't need to be. You have plenty of time, and it's worth making changes for everyone around you as well as yourself. And even in terms of what the film really inspires for people, which is to reach out and to develop community and to develop communication and connection. And that's never too late for that either. But you don't want to do it on your deathbed. You want to do it while you have time to nurture those relationships.
Exactly. Wow. And from here, definitely one more thing I'd love to mention, like, as you mentioned that you are more to each other's family because you were, it's a bond that you started sharing from your since class 1 grade. So, this is also a story about friendship that spans for long. So from here, like anything, any teachings you'd like to share, like what did making this film actually teach, like about the lifelong connections, so to all of you?
I want to jump in right away on that one because there's John and I hadn't spoken in maybe 40 years yet. And most of the guys who are in the film really didn't talk to one another during those 50 years in between high school. There were a few. And when you're watching the film, and people often say, look at that, lifelong friendships. Most of those relationships just existed in high school. But what happened because of this project, and like John is one of the most fantastic human beings I've ever known. And I have to say, there was a 45-year gap where I wasn't, taking advantage of that. We were
not for any reason except, and we were just actually in the same industry, ironically, which is crazy. But different areas of it, admittedly. But we just we never rubbed up against each other.
I know. And I look back now, and when I was getting to know everybody doing the interviews, in fact, one of my classmates, our classmates, Pat McCabe, says, gosh, looking around, there's not one of these guys that I wouldn't want to consider being a real friend with. And that was very honest because he hadn't seen these guys in 40 years. So it was really a beautiful thing to have those 4 years between 2020 with the quarantine and then at the reunion itself, because we got to know each other as human beings before we even got together in person. So that was kind of a beautiful thing. And then to see that chemistry happening in real life is terrific. And these are terrific men who I consider friends.
I think there's a universality of feeling about that, of the people that were part of this process. And I say a process, Avik, because we were not just making a film, we were also essentially producing a reunion.
Exactly.
And they often blur. They often were always synergistic, but they were often moving in parallel tracks, but also
Mm.
affecting each other and being affected by each other. And both of those really affected everyone in the class.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. From here, two things. I mean, like as you mentioned, it actually affected the whole class, like as you mentioned. And prior to this, well, also we were discussing about the generations, right? So, like when we reunite, right? So, for me also, like when I completed the college, and after that, we also had our reunions. So from reunion, one thing it's very very common. Like after decades, the classmates or the friends, everyone we're able to laugh, cry, confront their truths together. But what do you think? I mean, do you think that today's generation, I mean, obviously today's generation are more into digitally connected, but do they still have the same capacity for those kinds of friendships, like which were 50 years from now? So
Let's find
what's
out.
it?
Yeah, as being from a younger generation,
Uh-huh.
I'd say yes. I think that, there are some unique challenges to this moment in time. Like,
Uh,
there's people that I haven't spoken to in 10 years that I still follow on Instagram. And I sort of see what they're up to, but I haven't
uh,
actually connected with them in that really deep way in
uh,
many years. But I think we really crave that type of connection. It's
uh,
easier to sort of be surface level connected with social media and all of the online tools that we have. But legitimate connection, I think we're craving now more than ever. I think we don't always know how to actually achieve that, but it's something that I think is going to sort of naturally come about again.
uh,
And I say naturally, but it will take effort, but it's something that I think human beings can only go so long without real authentic connection. And we are social
uh,
creatures and we're meant to be together. So I think just our natural drives to be in spaces together, to share food, to laugh, to share our stories. I think that that's always going to win out. I think it's just something about human nature that it might be a weird moment in time right now, but I think it's going to come back for sure.
We're creating our own competition in a way with our technology
yeah.
evolutions and everything, because some of that, you mentioned earlier, I have been on the cutting edge of a lot of technology, and for people our
Uh,
age, I'm much more comfortable than many with
yep.
technology as it evolves, because it's just been part of my work. And so I've sort of been fascinated with this and seen this. And I think, convenience is the killer app of all time. Right. Social media essentially is a piece of the convenience puzzle, as is the internet in all its power. And there's a real double edge to that, because it really inhibits the connection at a nuanced level where you're willing to spend time and just be with people and just hang out with people. And, conversations can't just happen like that, and
Uh,
be sort of go right to the core of the matter. We even saw in the reunion very clearly that, it took 3 days, 2.5 days for it to evolve. And by the end of it, people didn't want to leave. But in the first
uh,
night, they weren't sure whether they wanted to be part of a 2.5 day event. Right.
yeah.
And the power of spending time, which is the antithesis of what social
Uh,
media kind of gears us towards, is really central to connection, I think.
Understood. Understood. Lovely. So, would love to talk about the audience impact as well. So, you are launching an impact campaign alongside the film. So, what kinds of community conversation or maybe the changes do you hope to see come out of this screenings?
John, your
I,
Mr. Impact campaign.
I wouldn't have just said what I said if I knew you were going to come back to me right away to talk. But uh, the impact campaign, I think, is extraordinarily exciting, because
Mhm.
we all try to make good films.
Yeah.
Every film we try to make, we hope to be a good film. And it's a communal endeavor. There's so many pieces. You never know whether it will be a good film or a great film or
Uh,
whatever. And in this case, it came out to be a film that really speaks to people and really
yeah.
offers the opportunity to accomplish something and to have impact. And when we say impact, we're talking about more than just having people see the film. We're talking about, how do you get people to use the film as a tool in their own life
Uh,
to help further their own sense of community and self-healing and their own mental health and their own positivity and empowerment. And so we're partnering with schools and nonprofits and, community groups and even some companies over the
okay.
coming months to bring the film into their communities much deeper than you would ever get
Uh,
with just distribution. through any form of distribution, to bring it into the heart of their communities and to spearhead conversations about the themes that the film illuminates. Because as you said earlier, this film isn't preaching anything. It's just setting a table because of the way the guys react to each other and what they share about their lives and how they've conducted their lives. And that becomes a fertile ground for communication and conversation. And that's what we're excited about doing, because people can take those into their lives, into their families, into their workplaces, etc. And that's what our impact campaign is.
One message, like, what do you most want the viewers, like whether they are 18 or 80, to walk away thinking or feeling after watching Fortune Sons?
I would say we have more in common than we have differences. And in watching the film and the reactions that, we've witnessed, you really see people touched in different parts of their heart, if that makes any sense. There's a shared vulnerability, and you can see that people want to be living life on a more meaningful, deeper level. But for that to happen, there has to be trust. And I hope that people, when they watch the film, are able to see trust being built between the guys while you're watching the film. So when they come together, you have this sense of celebration of trust having been earned. That's all.
And I would hope that after people watch that, maybe if they go out into their lives and encounter a difficult person or somebody that seems like they're having a bad day, they might think, okay, there could be something deeper going on, and not just take people at face value, but really consider the human being underneath and really remember to be empathetic as to what they might be going through. And if they can kind of keep that in mind and take the opportunity to reach out to an old friend or a new friend to get to know somebody better, just really taking that leap to reach out and make themselves a little bit vulnerable in order to find that deeper connection.
I think our hope as a species is actually that we find empathy for each other rather than antagonism and fear. And the only way past that is to actually meet people and to be open to who they are instead of othering them, as as the phrase goes. And I believe that's our hope. And every time I've seen someone meet someone face to face, other than women starting to get control of the world, which would be the most helpful thing, I think, for us, that empathy and that development of we are all in this together, as Peter says. And as Buckminster Fuller says, we're all just fellow travelers on spaceship Earth. That's our hope.
Lovely, lovely. So Peter, Taylor, and John, thank you so much for not just making a film, but for sharing the conversation that matters. And Fortunate Sons is more than a documentary, and it's a mirror. It's a mirror that held up to all of us, asking like how we show up as a friends, men and people. So that's really lovely. And for all the listeners who are listening right now, you can watch the premiere on PBS So-Called Plus on September 3rd, and with Encore and streaming available nationwide at pbsocall.org/Fortunate Sons and on the free PBS app as well. So if
and at
you
our
want to go,
website, you can get information. Fortunate-Sons.
Yeah. And like, yes, as mentioned, if you want to go further, so screening, market dialogue, and be a part of the movement, please visit fortunate-sons.com. So with this hope, until next time, remember that the conversations like this are not just the stories, but they are the invitations to healing. So keep listening, keep connecting, and keep riding that waves with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Avik.